Hello, I'm back. So we were just looking at the grounding of the theory for psychological egoism according to Feinberg, and then moving on to his critique of how it is that we have confusion with our understanding of psychological egoism according to Feinberg. So Feinberg opens this critique with the rather fascinating feature of PE as just a description, and hence ostensibly empirically evident is another way of seeing that this is actually having to do with data, stats, empirical evidence, and so forth to support the basic tenets of PE. Yet this is usually not the case, right? PE is often taken as a position of opinion who is relying on the supposition of some vast generality of the inclinations of human nature rather than the so-called proof of the theory of PE. So that's one of the main problems of it, again, is that it's often confused for for an ethical theory, and as a result, there are confusions that result, especially in terms of confusing data and statistical analysis, modeling, et cetera, as an ethical way of understanding selfish behavior when actually all it really is a description. Okay, so Feinberg moves to the next confusion of PE, specifically a logical confusion with the psychological egoist's first argument, 4a. So the psychological egoist's assumption is that it is characterized by selfishness, but is self-perpetuated by the pleasure we get from actions that are because they fulfill my own self-interests. So let's clarify that the word truism, which means something simple, something which means that something as point that is justified as analytic, an analytic truth, namely the idea that my motives and my desires and not someone else's is analytic. That is a technical way of identifying something as self-evident, okay? Or strictly known by reason could be another way of thinking about it. So a triangle has three sides, is a truism, and it's analytic. Triangle and three sides describe the same thing. That statement is self-evident. So Feinberg clarifies that an analytic statement cannot entail a synthetic statement in and of itself. So a synthetic statement then is an empirical statement known by way of perception. A synthetic statement is thus known empirically and cannot be justified on analytic terms alone. So, in other words, that every act is voluntarily an act promoted by the agent's own motives is a truism. So, and likewise, if we feel pleasure when this is true, this is merely a tautology, right? So, in other words, so if we analyze the statement, every voluntary act is motivated by the agent's own motives, we have the over-obvious point that the actions are voluntary. If the actions are voluntary, we are selfishly inclined to feel pleasure whenever such an act is acted upon. Yet what Feinberg points out is just because I do something voluntarily, I'm both automatically getting pleasure from the act and my own fulfillment is my own aim. Hereby, it's easy to see Feinberg's distinction, right? i.e., simply because I voluntarily choose to do X, Y, or Z does not automatically mean that my actions are selfishly motivated. Just because the source of my the act is mine, doesn't always mean that the act serves only my purpose and/or objectives, okay? All right, so adjoining this initial claim of the psychological egoist is that all voluntary actions are selfishly motivated, right? This is strengthened by added pleasure, and thus, and that is thought by the psychological egoist as her actions are rewarded by pleasure in terms of the fulfillment of actions, right? So to be sure, if the psychological egoist's actions are always selfishly motivated, then the fulfillment of such actions automatically entails the attainment of pleasure whenever such actions are enacted and/or satisfied. Okay, so the strong implication is that we as psychological egoists always attain satisfied pleasure when our actions are our own, and likewise when the actions get us what we want. So the classic presumption is that whenever we get what we want, we always receive pleasure. Often, we don't get the pleasure we aim for, and likewise, we sometimes attain the opposite of pleasure. Whenever we get what we want, we feel pain. Often, when we get what we want, we might feel pain, a conspicuous lack of satisfaction, the pleasure is lost, so on and so forth. So within this clarification is also the interesting point that the PE position, that the strong implication is that we always seek pleasure from our actions, as if pleasure is the only driver. It's the only motivation. As Feinberg posits, pleasure is not the only thing we desire, right? And therefore not the only consequence of voluntary actions. Okay. So then there's what Feinberg identifies as disinterested benevolence. So, which is encapsulated in the idea that if we're ascribing to an unexamined position of PE, any of my seemingly benevolent actions toward others are really selfish actions at the same time at their base, due to the assumption that any concern the psychological egoist has for others is really just selfishly motivated, right? To receive pleasure for my acts, right? My benevolence is not as authentically altruistic as it appears on the surface. Rather, I'm merely seeking selfish pleasure. So one interesting critique Feinberg makes is that if we take the argument that if pleasure is the aim, it's not always clear that the action's aim is solely selfish. So if we receive pleasure, then pleasure received is the result of something else other than pleasure, right? So with the Abe Lincoln story that Feinberg cites of saving the piglets in distress to obtain pleasure, so to obtain pleasure has within it the consequence of pleasure, right? Yet, for Abe Lincoln. Yet at the same time, there's the consequence of helping the pigs in distress as well, right? So that's not entirely the consequence of Lincoln's pleasure and or peace of mind. The pleasure obtained is actually only a byproduct of helping the animals in distress. So the pleasure obtained is brought to the fore simply by the action of helping something other than ourselves, right? And this is easily extended to the help we offer to others, people in need, etc., etc. So next, Feinberg identifies malevolence. So Like disinterested benevolence, where benevolence is thought by the psychological egoist to be selfishly pleasure-driven, etc., so is the similarity to problems of malevolence. In other words, ill will, hatred, malice, which also bring about sacrificing one's self-interest, right, to feel or bring about harm this time, right? So when we wish to harm someone, we don't do so to only appeal to our own self-interest or to even feel satisfied as a result for our actions and our feelings of malevolence, right? This has also an interesting positive effect or a heroic aspect in the case of people sacrificing their personal interests in order to help others who are being harmed by someone. Facing down a violent assailant, stepping up as a whistleblower, etc., etc. So even the malevolence has aspects that we could see are not always as the psychological egoist thinks, right? Or really misunderstands. Okay, so with Feinberg's continued critique of PE, we find that he terms a lack of evidence for universal self-deception, okay? So Feinberg doesn't so much think this is a logical fallacy as much as it's one that lacks enough evidence to back up a claim that the psychological egoist is entirely driven from self-interest, okay? So Feinberg basically claims that there's simply not enough evidence to back up the claim. Yet it's easy to be dubious of the claim that people sometimes act out of the interest of others, right? Yet such a claim is not so easy to prove or to validate conclusively. So we cynically rely on speculation. We doubt the integrity of altruistic motivations of others without having conclusive evidence to support such a claim, right? So then Feinberg's second to the last critique of PE has to do with what we call the paradox of hedonism. And with that, we won't cover his points on education that he makes as well. So here, the paradox is just that. Just that. At once, it seems obvious to seek pleasure for the benefit of the egoist, straightforward. And it seems that that is a no-brainer. Yet, this is the nature of the paradox, right? So even as we stridently wish to achieve and aim for pleasure, pleasure is not always found, right? Hence, it's often elusive, right? So more often than not, if all I'm doing is aiming to seek and achieve pleasure, I sometimes do not achieve pleasure, right, that I aim for. So we need to be careful here to designate that yes, it's still possible to get pleasure when I aim for it outright. Yet, I need to understand that just because I wish for it to be the reward of my efforts doesn't always guarantee such pleasurable success. So that's really what we're looking at, is the difference between how it is that the psychological egoist thinks that all of my motivations and ways of seeking pleasure must be this way 100% of the time, right? And what we're seeing is that if we have that insistence, that's a lot of the problem as well, as we could see here in the paradox of pleasure, the pleasure paradox. So hence, the face value of pleasure seeking is paradoxical and deceptive, right? So then, lastly, Feinberg presents the critique of PE with the problem of pleasure as satisfaction. So this is easily explained by the infinite regress of desiring satisfaction. We desire satisfaction as psychological egoists, yet to desire satisfaction is empty in and of itself. given that to desire satisfaction is also to satisfy desires, and is hence vacuous. It is not clearly definitive as to the object of desire other than desire itself. So if I wish for satisfaction,